on. And the first question I have to ask everybody is, how did you become an anarchist?
Yeah, it's a darn good question. So I was brought up as a regular run-of-the-mill economist, mathematical training, the whole bit. Had never heard of von Mises, Rand, any of this stuff. And this is post-PhD, right? So I meet one of my former students worked for the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I worked with them for a little while. They introduced me to the Institute for Humane Studies, and for the first time, I'm hearing academics, these are the Austrian people, philosophers and economists, making arguments for personal liberty from a philosophical perspective, something I'd never heard before. Economists are generally, you can ask them what they think about free markets, and they'll tell you free markets tend to operate better than controlled markets. But never before had I heard philosophical arguments. So this led me from being, what I'd say probably a middle-of-the-road Republican to a libertarian, and then I started really thinking about the thing. And when you make that jump from whatever you are before to libertarian, it's a slippery slope. Because the more you think about limited government, the more you start realizing that there may not indeed be any role for government at all.
Yeah, but I don't know exactly, I've never heard how you got started or what your background was. Were you born an anarchist? Or?
Well, Ron Paul says we're born free. He thinks that libertarians have that impulse right from the beginning. And I think that was certainly true of me. My dad was a Taft Republican, sort of an old right Republican. So he started, that was of course a plus too. But right from the earliest days, even in grammar school, I was arguing with my teachers and on ideological matters. So I've sort of always been involved, and I made one mistake in my life. I got very much involved in the Goldwater campaign as a kid. Gave a lot of money, worked very hard, because I later came to the conclusion the whole thing was just a trick. It was a trick by sort of the CIA conservatives, Bill Buckley and those people, to end the pro-peace elements of the old right and make everybody a Cold War conservative, which it pretty much did. But then later I had the chance to go to work for a publishing company called Arlington House, which was the only libertarian or conservative publishing house at that time. And one day, my boss, Neil McCaffrey, said, "How'd you like to be Ludwig von Mises's editor?" Holy smokes, right? So, as a very young guy, I got to help publish a new monograph of Mises's and also bring 3 of his books back into print.
Wow.
So that's how I got my start, but I was already interested in Austrian economics. As a young boy, a friend of my dad's had given me Hazlitt's Economics 1 lesson, and we always read his Newsweek column, my father and myself. So I guess I've been involved in these ideas for a very long time, and it's, of course, a great blessing, great fun and thrill.
And so I have to ask you, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, first of all, Jeff, thanks for having me. I was glad to have you as a guest on my own show some time ago. And you're right, I've been making all these videos for the Ron Paul homeschool program, which maybe we can talk about a little bit later. One of the courses that I prepared for it, by the way, is a government course, but I privately call it my anti-government course, because the whole thing is, I've got Lysander Spooner in there. Like, these kids aren't going to know what hit them by the time they're finished. But to answer your question, I got interested in this stuff about, well, I guess a little over 20 years ago. I started off as a middle-of-the-road Republican. Like, I wanted to cut the budget a little bit, and I wanted foreign policy bellicosity. Like the typical loser, pretty much. That's what I was, and I didn't know any better. I didn't know any alternatives. So I just fell into the Rush Limbaugh crowd, and I eventually crawled my way out of there. I do actually talk a little bit about my own experiences and how I got out of it in my new book. But to make a long story short, I got acquainted with the works of Rothbard, for instance, and I thought, this guy is so great. I loved reading him. I loved his articles. He was still alive when I got to know about him, and I even got to meet him a number of times, and I loved him. But I thought, I can go with him 95% of the way, but I just can't make those last few percentage points work. But it stayed with me. It stayed with me. And then over the years, I passed through a number of phases in the 1990s. Like, I was like a Buchananite for a while, and paleo this and that for a while, and just trying to find my way. Like, I had been really, really startled by Rothbard, and I knew I wasn't a leftist, and I couldn't figure out what I really was. But finally, in the early probably 2001, or 2002, 2001 or 2, whenever Hans Hoppe's book, Democracy, the God That Failed, came out, I read that, and that really confirmed for me that I belonged in the Rothbardian camp. Like, I thought everything I believe about the way society works and everything I know about the way government works tells me that I should prefer voluntary solutions. Everything, the economic analysis, the moral analysis, the history, everything tells me that. So why am I such a, mealy-mouthed pansy about just taking the whole message? And plus I didn't like the idea that I still felt like, well, I do need John McCain for something. It was liberating to be able to say, maybe I don't need that SOB for anything. So it really was a matter of just taking what I believed and bringing it to its logical conclusion. But, a lot of times people say, what's the difference between a minarchist and an anarchist? And the answer is 6 months. Well, for me, it was like 8 years. Because it was 8 years of fighting it off and saying, no, I can't go that way. But I just decided that it seems like everything the state is involved in is an awful fiasco for humanity. So maybe it never deserves the benefit of the doubt. And before you say, but wait a minute, what about courts? Unless you've read what our side has written on that subject, don't come telling me that that's the objection. Read what we've said and then talk to me.
Well, I'll tell you how I started out. It was actually a conventional Pilgrim's Progress. I remember, this is the truth, when I was living in Chicago, actually, for a while, and we drove through the slums of Chicago, and this would have been in like 1953 or 54, and I remember this as clear as day. I was shocked at the, terrible conditions these black people were living in, and I don't know where the hell I got this idea, but I asked my mother, and she did it, to type a letter which I dictated to President Eisenhower saying, can you do something? So from my point of view, people that want the government to do something think the way maybe an intelligent 8-year-old would think with that degree of sophistication. But then as time went on, I grew in wisdom and grace, and I turned from being a liberal, which I was. I read Barry Goldwater's book, Conscience of a Conservative, and I said, oh, that's really more what I am. So then I considered myself a conservative with some reservations. And what would have been the next step? Oh, I know. I became an intellectual conservative after I started reading National Review of Bill Buckley when I was in college. And I despise Buckley now, of course. The next thing that happened to me, and probably the most important thing, was I read Ayn Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. And I remember that totally clearly. After I read the first page of The Virtue of Selfishness, I had to put the book down because I couldn't believe that somebody had crystallized everything that I've been thinking my whole life. So,
the first page.
Just the first page, and of course I tore through the book. But it's a little bit of good news and bad news, because at that point I thought Rand was a genius. Of course she is a genius. And I became a Randite for a couple of years, which is not a good thing, of course. It's like joining a religious cult. But she's so right about almost everything. And then the next and in some ways final step of my evolution was when I read a book called The Market for Liberty by Morris Linda Tannehill. And at that point, I realized that I was actually an anarchist. How old was I? I was on a treasure hunting expedition for 3 months, so I was 24 when I read that book.
It is, how did you become an anarcho-capitalist?
As best I recall, when I went to college, my view was classical liberal. That is, I thought that government needed to provide police, courts, and defense, but not much else. And what really changed my mind on that, in as much as any single thing, was Heinlein's novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Because it seemed to me that I had a sort of implicit proof, though I never made it explicit, that you couldn't provide police and courts from inside the market system. They had to be an external framework that the market worked within. And a theorem is defeated by a single counterexample. So Heinlein provided what seemed to me was a plausible fictional description of a society in which there was no government, and yet law and law enforcement were being provided in a decentralized manner inside the market system. If that was possible in his society, then it couldn't be impossible in general. And that got me interested in trying to work out a plausible picture of something analogous for something much more like the society I lived in. And that's really what part 3 of Machinery of Freedom came out of.
It's a matter of degree, but I have a couple of first principles that I expect that you, Jeff, and most people watching and listening to us now would accept. And that is, first, that the individual is greater than the state. The individual has an immortal soul and free will. The state is merely an aggregation of people trying to live at somebody else's expense with a monopoly on force. Theoretically, it's here today and gone tomorrow. So the idea of balancing a right of an individual against the power of the state is anathema to me. The right of an individual is a natural existing right, and it would always trump the prerogatives of the state, except when the right of the individual is interfering with the right of someone else's, the exercise of someone else's natural right. I also adhere, of course, to the non-aggression principle, that the affirmative offensive use of aggression is always wrong. It is only valid in a defensive mechanism. That, of course, would remove almost everything that the state does from the state's armament. So with those two principles, the primacy of the individual and the inviolability of the non-aggression principle, follows just about everything else that I believe, philosophically, politically, and economically.
Got to ask you, how did you become an anarchist?
Oh, thanks. It's really nice to have you here, and I'm thrilled to be able to chat with you. So I've always been kind of into free markets and the idea that businesses can help people. And I was actually not really thinking about it too systematically before college. But when I started taking classes with Professor Walter Block, my favorite undergraduate professor, he would go through example after example and say, you know, one of the great things about markets is the producer has to serve the customer. He would then contrast with government and talk about how monopoly doesn't help people. But he didn't really extend the logic to what I was fully expecting. And so he would say he actually did not present the full case. And he would say, well, you know, a government should just do certain things like police and courts and military. And I was just thinking about that. In my college, we used to have, everybody would go to these parties, underage drinking would occur, and the cops would raid them, and they were always spoiling everybody's fun. And I was thinking, well, you know, this kind of sounds very similar to what Professor Block is talking about in class, where the government is not there to make sure people are happy, especially harassing 20-year-old kids. We're just having
the government is definitely not there to make sure you are happy. That's definitely not one of the things the government does.
So we needed to fight for our right to party.
Here they come now. I can hear the cops coming
now. They're right outside my window hearing me say that. And so I was just really thinking, well, you know, they don't act in the same way that, for example, the on-campus security at my college, where it's a private college, they were very friendly, but the minute you step off campus, the police were quite maybe a little bit less friendly. So at one point I went into Professor Block's office. He asked us what we wanted to write our papers on, and I said to him, I'm thinking about writing about the following topic, and I wanted to run it by you. My topic is going to be called Why Libertarians Are Communists. And he's like, what? And he said, what do you mean by that? And I think I might have even said, why libertarians are commies. And he said, what are you talking about? And then I said, well, you're always talking about how the private sector, the voluntary sector, is always so much better than the coercive government sector. And why should we make exceptions to that for things like police and courts. And he said, he looked around and he said, step into my office. And he basically told me that there's two types of libertarians. There's some who believe in government monopoly over police and courts, and there's others who don't. So just started reading about it then, and it's been a great set of interesting research since to see how common this is. It's not just a science fiction idea. It's like actually very common to see private security, private rules and regulations everywhere in the world today. Even with governments, we see private rules and regulations. And to think it's not so far-fetched after all.
Really talked, or I've never heard a podcast where you've talked much about your background, how you got into anarchism and these sort of things. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey to anarchism?
Sure. I mean, I started out as a good old-fashioned Canadian socialist cub. I grew up in England. I was born in Ireland. I grew up in England, and then I came to Canada when I was about 11 with my family. And yeah, I thought socialism was, you know, the usual, taking care of people, being nice to people, and helping the poor, the sick, the old, and the disadvantaged, and so on. And that all seemed like a very good idea. And then a friend of mine, who's now an economics professor, got into the band Rush. And I was into sort of darker and gloomier stuff. I was more of a Floyd fellow, but he was into Rush. And Rush, the drummer, is very influenced by Ayn Rand. And so he passed me over a copy of The Fountainhead, which I devoured, I'm pretty sure, in 2 days. And I just found it like an electrical butterfly having an epileptic attack on my frontal lobes. It just really woke up dormant parts of my brain. And it's a very, very powerful and heady mixture. I think I was 15 or 16 at the time, and through there I got into libertarianism and all of that kind of stuff. And I did that for an embarrassing amount of time, sort of in hindsight. I'd never been exposed to any anarchic thinking at all. I guess I'd read a few of the 19th century Russian anarchists, but they were mostly leftists or sort of anarcho-communists, and they didn't really hold much appeal to me. And so I got into the Austrian School of Economics, and I devoured more Rand and Hayek and Bastiat and all of these other great writers. And then the strangest thing happened. I was having a debate with someone at work. I hadn't really been, I was an entrepreneur for 15 years. I didn't really do much with philosophy or politics. And we were talking about the environment. And this idea sort of came to me during the debate about how the environmental issues could be solved without the state. And I spent a lot of time in the environmental field as an entrepreneur. I knew it fairly well. And it was just like one of these, you know, again, one of these sort of blow your space station brain patterns out of orbit of your head. And from there, I sort of said, okay, well, if it could work for that, because, you know, the magic answer is the government. How do we deal with criminals? The government. How do we deal with the environment? The government. It's this magical answer, and it doesn't actually solve anything. It's the worst kind of answer, which is an answer where you think you have an answer, but you don't actually have an answer. And so I started looking at ways in which voluntary insurance and free market associations could solve really difficult and complex social problems, like air pollution and real nasty hardened criminality and so on. And I just found that there really was no limit to this theory. Now, as I later found out, I was reinventing the wheel in 6 different ways from Sunday, because, you know, great anarchic theorizers had paved the way, and I think I had a few extra things to add, but people like Murray Rothbard and so on had all gone this way before and done some fantastic work in it. But it was all new to me, and so I began to take that approach, and it removed the fundamental challenge that the minarchist or the objectivist has, which is, if the non-initiation of force is the moral absolute, and if property rights are the moral absolute, then you can't have a government. I mean, you just can't. It's like being an atheist and saying you need God to move the solar system. These two things don't work together. So that was sort of my journey, and as I sort of began podcasting and writing more, and wrote a couple of books on anarchy and all of that, and discussed it more and faced more critical questions from others and from myself, I was such a reluctant anarchist. It was a label I never ever imagined I would apply to myself, and it is, you know, it really was big kicking and screaming by the extreme demons of reason and evidence, if that makes any sense.
Griffin, I have to ask you how did you become a voluntarist?
Well, people always say that's a good question when they don't know how to answer it. And so that I start off with that line, it's a good question, because I really don't know when or how I became a voluntarist. But I think, like with many people, it was a slow, gradual process, an awakening, and kind of overcoming a lot of resistance, because to become a pure, philosophically pure thinker in this realm, you have to get rid of a lot of old ideas and a lot of previous programming and preconceptions, and that's a painful process. It's like removing an integral part of your body and like a vital organ, you know, and so I became I started down that path, as I recall. As many of us do, we write a book or we make a speech or something, and people say, there's an expert. And then they come to you and they start asking you questions. And that immediately exposes the shallowness of your knowledge, because they have so many questions and we have so little knowledge. But it forces you to think. And, you know, there's an old saying that the best way to learn something is to try and teach it. And I have certainly found that to be true. And so when you start talking to people about problems, economic problems and social problems, and they think, well, here's a guy, he's offered himself as an expert, so-called, on these things. They start asking you questions, and the inevitable question is, what do you suggest is a better way? And that's a showstopper, you know. It's easy to know what we don't like. It's not so easy to know what we would replace it with, how a system would work better, especially if it's never been tried and when it's all theoretical. When you're just going on the basis of your human experience, your logic, some knowledge based on human nature, all of that sort of thing. You put together a theory of how things should be, and naturally that makes you very vulnerable, because you cannot defend your theory based upon solid historical evidence. But anyway, that is sort of an introduction to my answer to your question, and I began to realize that we needed a creed, something to believe in, and it was back in 2002 that I created an organization. Is called Freedom Force International. And it's based on the assumption that we needed a counterforce in the world. It's not enough just to be informed or to be aware or to be honest and to have good heart for your fellow man. You have to put these concepts into social movement. You have to embed it in the society, because it's not really a question of numbers either. If you can have 51% of the people wanting something, you can have 60%, 80%, 99% of the people wanting something. But if that 1% has an exclusive control over all of the weapons of the world, if they have all of the guns and all of the atomic bombs and all of the horrific weapons, the 99% is going to fall in line. That's what. That's the fundamental principle behind all prisons in the world. The number of inmates far exceed the number of guards and the warden. And so, having said that, I realized then that we had to implement these ideas. It's not enough just to have numbers. Now, we're all going to be good people and do the best thing for our fellow man. We have to pay attention to that 1% that have the guns and have the force of society over us. So then now you start looking at this thing called power. Who holds the power? And I remember back as a young fellow, and that's almost a laugh now to say that at my age, because to me 70 could fit that category of being a young fellow. But anyway, I mean really young. Back in my late 20s and early 30s, I was an activist in a sense. I was very concerned with some of these issues, and I was giving presentations. And I remember very distinctly when we came to this juncture in the discussion of what are you going to do about it, what's a better solution, da-da-da, I would say, well, power is the evil, the concentration of power in the hands of the state, or in the hands of anyone, in the hands of corporations. It doesn't have to be the state. The same power can exist in the hands of a corporation or a partnership or in the hands of one sole person. And even though we don't call it the state, or don't call it the government, it's still it's the overwhelming presence of power over us. And so it still turns out the same way, regardless of what we call it. And I thought, therefore, power was the problem. And the ideal society, I thought in those days, was to get rid of all forms of power over us. And then one morning, I do remember, I don't remember the exact date, but it was about 2000, the year 2000. I woke up in the morning, and literally, it's almost like I could see this like a scene in a movie. Here's the hero of the movie struggling in bed. He's sleeping. He's having nightmares. He's trying to solve all the problems of the world. And all of a sudden, about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, he sits up in bed in the darkness of his room, and he says, "I've got it. We lose." And that, I remember that. It was literally like that, because I was thinking about this issue of power, and I kept saying, no, power is the problem. Get rid of power. And you know, Lord Acton's famous phrase rings in your head, you know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he's absolutely correct, you know. And therefore, we tend to focus on this thing of power. But then I realized that I've been preaching that, no, we don't want power. We must back away from the struggle for power. And because power is dangerous, power is corrupting. And then I realized that that means automatically we lose, because there is a struggle for power out there. And throughout history, I believe this, now I'm getting to my opinions, I think that it's a natural relationship among humans. This became very clear to me after reading that great book called The Territorial Imperative, which we may come back to later. But it has to do with some of these human instincts that we have, and they have a survival value to us. For example, the instinct for group, the affinity to tribe, and the clan and the nation and so forth. And even high schools have an affinity to their team, and soccer players have this affinity to group, and they have identity to this group to which we belong. And we say, isn't that silly? Isn't that awful? Isn't this thing called patriotism to nation just blind patriotism, where we say, you know, our country, right or wrong? And everything falls apart at that point when you throw in the wrong part. But nevertheless, the point is that this is instinctive. It comes packaged with our genetic code. And and throughout history, and all the species, all the way down to almost to the level of the lowly worm, you don't see it there, but very soon above the worm, you find this territorial imperative and this group imperative, this clan loyalty imperative. And it's probably necessary. In fact, my wife and I were talking about this just this morning. It's probably necessary for survival, because, you know, when you're traveling in a group, the stragglers on the outside are the ones that usually, animals I'm talking about, you know, predators in the African veldt, it's the lions attacking the buffalo and so forth. It's always the ones on the outside that get it, that fall prey to the predators, and so there's safety in the group. And so there's you can say there's a certain evolutionary, and I don't mean that in terms of genetic evolutionary, but through experience of the species, that if you don't have a loyalty or affinity to the group, you're probably not going to have the same chances for survival. And so, getting back now, I realize that this is probably, in my view, always going to be the case, that there will be in human society those who hold power. The question is, who will it be, and what their philosophy will be? And if we surrender the struggle for power, that means we are always going to be controlled by those who have not surrendered that struggle for power. And it's a harsh reality. And I think of it in terms of this attitude toward guns. Now, we all know that guns are dangerous. Guns are very dangerous. People get killed accidentally with guns. Criminals can use guns. Guns are really dangerous. The only thing more dangerous than having guns is not having guns, because somebody will have them, and it might even be your trustworthy politicians who have acquired a monopoly over the guns, and they suddenly decide they don't have to be trustworthy anymore because they've got the guns, and so forth. So guns are dangerous, and the solution, therefore, is not to get rid of your guns, but the solution is to have guns and do everything you can to make sure that people use them responsibly, and get on with the job of finding the criminals, criminals and stopping the criminals and preventing crime, even though guns exist. So the same thing is true with power, I believe. Power is dangerous, like guns. The only thing more dangerous than having power is not having power. And I think that's the message of today, that we who advocate individual responsibility, individualism versus collectivism, we don't like this collective power and the thought that the group is more important than the individual, that the individual must be sacrificed for the better good of the greater number, and all of that nonsense. We who do not like that used to say, well, therefore, let's back away from the struggle and let these guys have all the power. And the result of that action is where we live today. This mess we're living in today is exactly the result of that power. So then, having gone through all that agony and coming out the other side with this realization that power, even though it's dangerous and creates a lot of problems for society, it is a necessary thing, maybe not necessary, it's an inevitable thing is the better word. Then how do we acquire power, and how do we create a system in which even ourselves and those who inherit the power which we have succeeded in obtaining, we are restrained is from being corrupted, as Lord Acton would say? Are there really mechanisms and ideas that we can put in place that will accomplish that? I believe there are, and I have to admit that's a weak argument because it has never been done yet in history. So there's a temptation to say, well, it's never been done, therefore it cannot be done. But another thing that's never happened in history is that people have never thought quite along these same lines before. We've always assumed that in order to overcome the crimes of society or the crimes of the world, all the travesties that come in the wake of totalitarianism, we've always assumed that these were bad people. And all we had to do is get rid of the bad people, and then somehow the ones who stepped into their place would miraculously be good people. And we never focused on the system that supported the bad people, or in my view, the system that created these bad people. You can put good people into a bad system, and they will be converted into bad people. And maybe they all will not be, but most of them will be. And even the ones who are successful in resisting that temptation, they don't live forever. And they're eventually replaced by somebody who will fall into the traditional pattern. Okay, I'm giving you this evolution of my awareness, and finally you come to the question of voluntarism. What is that? Well, that's part of the solution. If we're going to have a system in which power exists, and when I'm talking about power, I'm talking about the absolute power of coercion, physical force. I'm talking about the power of the gun, the bayonet, the chemical bomb, nuclear weapons, this kind of absolute physical power. And it exists in the world, so it's going to be there. We can't just say, let's ban atomic weapons, because there's no such thing. Who's going to ban atomic weapons unless they have atomic weapons, you see? And that's the whole joke behind the disarmament movement of the world. They talk about banning atomic weapons and putting the United Nations in charge of that banning process. That really means we're going to turn all of the atomic weapons over to the United Nations. That's what that means. So we're back to that theme again. You can't get rid of this dangerous thing called power, but how do you limit it? How do you control it? And how do you prevent it from continuing this terrible thread of history that we've been through? So you come back to this thing, voluntarism. How do you conduct a society, whether you call it a state or a region or a family or whatever it is, a cooperation, a cooperative? I like the word protectorates and all that, but the name is not important. How do you conduct groups of people interacting with each other in such a way that you can divide power into those things which justify the use of power and those things which do not justify the use of power in that way? And all of a sudden I realized once I started thinking along those lines, it was clear. It was already in history. It was already in the books. It was already spoken about and described at length by the great philosophers of the past. And it's sometimes referred to today as the principle of non-aggression. In other words, we have, let's back off a little bit. What are the things that we are justified in provoking our use of violence and physical coercion and force? Some people would say none. The pacifists would say there's no justification for the use of violence. Okay, they can believe that, but I think most of them, if they were confronted with the face-to-face confrontation between somebody who was attempting to do bodily harm to themselves, or to their loved ones, they somehow would change their point of view. They would say, we have to stop this person from killing my wife or my husband or my children and or my loved ones. They must do something, and even at the extent of using force. Well, when you follow that chain of logic all the way to the end, you come to the point, well, yes, we all feel that at least some may say, I would never use violence to save my own life. Okay, good for them. I would. And I think most people would say, I'd hate the idea. I hope it never comes to that. But boy, if it's between me or this criminal, then it's got to be the criminal. It's got to be the person trying to take away my life. Or even in a more benign situation, two people in the ocean, you know, the old idea, swimming around, and there's only one little life ring. It'll only support one person, and here are two of them struggling for survival. It's a grim analogy, but it's true. One has got to go. Now, who will blame either of those two people for struggling to be that one person, even though the other person they know, if they succeed in pushing them away, is going to drown? Well, you might say it's the better thing to do is to give your own life and let the other person survive, and that's a wonderful point of view. But very few people would condemn the person who would struggle for life. Okay. This is the grim basis, the hardcore analogy that we have to come to analyze these issues. So what is it that we are justified in using violence or coercion or lethal force for? And most people come to the conclusion that it's defensive only. And there's the critical thought, defensive use of force. To defend what? Okay, to defend three things. Seems to always come to the surface, to the top of this discussion. To defend your life, your liberty, and your property. Now, those are all different ways of saying to defend yourself. I mean, those are extensions of yourself. And so therefore, you can, philosophically and morally, ethically, you can use coercion to defend your life, liberty, or property. Okay, but nothing more. That doesn't mean, yeah, you have the right to go to your neighbor and say, look, I don't like the fact that you open your shop on Sunday because it violates my religious principles, and therefore I'm going to force you, if you don't close your shop on Sunday, I'm going to kill you. I mean, this is absurd. We do not have the authority to go to our neighbors and coerce them to do anything except not to take our life, liberty, or property. That's all. We cannot be aggressive. We cannot be constructive in a way. We have to be negative, purely defensive. And if we can't do that as individuals, then we cannot delegate that power to our elected representatives to do it for us. And there is the essence of the problem right there. We ask in modern society, we think that we have the right to ask our elected representatives to do things that we ourselves are not allowed to do. And therein is a problem. We might want to come back to that. So now I'm going to finally, hopefully, come back to the point where I realized what this voluntarism was all about. Once you come to that point in your thinking, you have to start thinking, well, all right, how would you not construct such a society, because it's not within our authority to construct. To construct means you have power over it. But how would you like to see it evolve if all of these illogic elements were removed, if all the wrong thinking was removed? How would people come together and voluntarily create a society? And the question finally comes up, well, yeah, but that's going to cost money. How are you going to pay for this? You going to have taxes to pay for it? Well, the instinct, the way we come up through this chain of thinking on this is, well, you got to have taxes for it. So how are you going to pay for this? Well, how are you going to collect the taxes from somebody who doesn't want to pay for the taxes? Well, you have to use coercion. Oh, you mean you're going to put him in jail, use the gun? You're back to that again? And that's, oh, wait a minute. Let me go back and start from the beginning on this. Anybody that's logically consistent on this has to come to that point and say, okay, this is hard to say, but taxes have to be voluntary. And of course, all the naysayers descend on you and say, oh, well, that's not practical. We're not talking about practical. We're talking about right, you see. And I believe that if something is right, then it's the most practical thing of all. If something is wrong, but they say it's practical, well, then I don't think it's practical at all. It's just an excuse. So once you can get your brain around the fact that a society can be funded through voluntary contributions, then you are a voluntarist. You are a voluntarist. You've arrived. You didn't even know it. That was my point. And after I got to that point, I turned around and looked backwards, and I realized that, hey, I believe that if you can run a society on voluntary donations and without the use of coercion, even the conducting of a fire department or a police force or an army, and I do believe now that I've had a chance to think that through, that those are all very possible and practical, actually. Once you get to there, you are a voluntarist or an anarcho-capitalist or whatever you want to call yourself. You have arrived, and now you are my brother.
You've just won the gold medal for the best answer to how did you become a voluntarist ever. After 200 episodes of Anarchast, that was the best answer I've ever heard. You're obviously so full of knowledge and experience. For people who don't know, you're 83 years old. It's hard to believe. You don't look it at all, and your mind definitely doesn't sound 83. As many people in their 80s tend to slow down a bit.
The very first question we ask everyone, James, is how did you become an anarchist?
I became an anarchist because they see that the political system doesn't work, and basically, as well, who wants somebody to make decisions for you? Nobody knows better how to run your life than what you do, right? And I became an anarchist, or I started looking into anarchy in my teenage years, when first of all I gave up religion, and I also came across a band called Crass in the UK. A guy by the name of Penny Rumbold, and you know what they were saying about how, you know, politics basically is just it's just enslavement. It's where a certain group of people, the ruling class, get to force their will on you by legislating, making laws and stuff like that. And of course, you know, government basically is nothing but that. It is force. It makes people do things that they don't want to do. It stops people from doing things that they do want to do, and those demands are always backed up by police with guns. So that's what made me become an anarchist.
Before we begin, I always like to ask everyone, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, I think that my journey was a frustratingly slow one in retrospect, but I think a lot of people go through a similar process. Basically, I've been researching for the last 7 or 8 years now, and had my website for the last 6 years, looking into the deep state connections that behind the national security state apparatus that arose in the wake of the National Security Act of 1947, and the creation and institutionalization of the CIA, and then we saw how the CIA immediately started using its powers to start to overthrow democratically elected leaders in foreign countries, in Iran, in Chile, and South America generally. And I've been looking and researching at that and how that developed into the networks that formed around Iran-Contra in the 1980s, and how that extended into the 1990s with CIA drug smuggling, how it continues through today through events like 9/11 and the basically the commandeering of American foreign policy towards endless intervention in the Middle East and unpopular wars of aggression that continue to occur. And I've been researching and documenting this for a number of years now, and it has, I think I started out in the way that a lot of people do when they're encountering this information, looking for that mythical return to some sort of constitutional government, and we don't need to really scrap government. That would be radical. What we need to do is just reform it, bring it back to buy-in of the people like it used to be, supposedly. And it took, as I say, a frustratingly long time for me to start to shake off of those statist delusions that government has ever been anything about the coalescing of that power in the hands of a small ruling clique, and the institutionalization of the monopoly and the use of force that comes along with that. So that's exactly, unfortunately, the situation that we're in. And it took a very long time for me to realize that the solution is not to try to reduce government or bring it back to its rightful size or something of that sort. It took me a while to really start to align my philosophy with my own ideals and my own understanding of the situation, so that I finally eventually realized that in fact it was the statist delusion that is at the core of so much of this corruption that would not be able to exist if we didn't have these centralized institutions. And that's really where I've arrived at in the last couple of years. So now I'm more actively exploring the idea of anarchy and how that can be used as a solution to so many of these problems that we're facing.
How did you become an anarchist?
Well, so I was, I guess, like most people, a believer in sort of so-called minimal government for a long time. We're like, oh, well, we can't have a system where there's no government at all, you know.
Right.
And then it just dawned on me one day that Murray was right. And I was friends with Murray during this period. He had a big influence. Murray Rothbard had a big influence over me personally.
Right.
And I thought, well, he's a little bit dangerous with this whole anarchism thing, but I'll go along with him. There's so much to learn from him. And then one day I just realized that there was nothing wrong with the society that government could improve. And it just kind of snapped. I thought, you know, everything government does that needs to be done can be done by the market better, and there's nothing government can do to what's wrong with society to improve over the present situation. And so I changed. And then over time you realize anarchism is just embedded in the structure of social life. I mean, we conduct our lives in a state of anarchy all the time. And by which I mean we're orderly. We don't have master-slave relationships. We seek out mutual benefit one with another, you and I together, and every other person on the planet. So to the extent that there's peace and there's prosperity, it indicates the presence of a beautiful form of anarchy. So that's it. You know, don't you think it's important for people to get rid of the idea of the state? I mean, for the purpose of intellectual development. I mean, it's a freeing up that takes place. And once you rid yourself of the myth of the state, everything becomes possible.
Yeah. Ask our first-time guest is, how did you become an anarchist?
Murray Rothbard. I met Murray Rothbard when I was about 21 years old. It was back in about 1983, and Murray was not merely charming, but one of the most powerful arguers and intellectual forces I've ever met. When I met Murray, I had come to libertarianism through civil liberties, and I had divided the whole area to some degree of libertarianism into civil liberties and economics, and it seemed to me that depending on which one you focused on was a defining aspect of the kind of the characteristics with which you argued and what you pursued in the movement. When I met Murray, I realized that there was no division between civil liberties and economics, that it was all one set of rights, that your right to make a living was indistinguishable from your freedom of speech, from your freedom of religion, that it was all a matter of the control over your own body and your right to express yourself. And it was a big revelation for me. And the fact that he was so charming, frankly, was a large part of my...
Did you have a crush on him?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Purely platonic, but I've often said that I don't know whether or not I became an anarchist because of the strength of his arguments or because he called me sweetie so often. And he had this lovely, lovely Brooklyn accent when he said, "Oh, sweetie." It just was lovely.
I've always been at least a non-aggressor, you know, since I've been engaged in politics, not since I was born or when I was in the Marines, but I've been confident in my belief in the non-aggression principle, the self-ownership principle, and it's just, someone asked me yesterday, did you hold back in your media before recently, now that you've been a little more radical, talking from the anarcho-capitalist perspective? And it's not that, it's just that I've been honing my skills, I've been deepening my own thought, I've been developing my ability to communicate from a deeper perspective from the philosophy. So I've never held back, but I'm certainly better at speaking from the anarcho-capitalist perspective now.
And when did you learn about things like non-aggression, or you just knew it naturally?
Well, I was always a fan of Ron Paul growing up, at least through high school, because I was a libertarian. And the reason I was a libertarian was first and foremost because I wanted to be a punk. You know, I was always a troublemaker kid, a healthy disrespect for authority. oh, I'm not going to be a Republican or a Democrat. Oh, I can be a libertarian, you know. And it was more motivated by that, and being an intellectual libertarian in the sense that anybody not indoctrinated into one dogma or another can see that the world just kind of works better when people get to choose what they do with their own bodies, when we're free to engage in the economy the way that we want as individuals, and we're not killing each other in large numbers and, you know, engaging in the systematic destruction of human bodies by machinery, or as politicians call it, war. So in that sense, I was always a libertarian, but I still was in the Marines. I enlisted. That didn't stop me from throwing my body at the Leviathan in that sense. And
so you went into the Marines with this philosophy?
Well, it wasn't a philosophy back then. That's my point. It was, I would say I was an issues libertarian or an intellectual libertarian, similar to Gary Johnson. And it's kind of sad this year that we have this great opportunity to spread the message when you've got Obamacare versus Romney care. And you've got Gary Johnson as an awesome alternative to that, who was such a great guy and has backed up everything that he said he believed in as governor. But he's not a libertarian. You know, he's not quite there, not in the philosophical sense. So, coming back from Iraq, I was really active in the anti-war movement and surrounded by liberals. And the first thing that motivated me to do was study economics and really learn my framework. And I remember there was a moment it clicked during the 2008 bailouts. And I was sitting on the couch at the Iraq Veterans Against the War House that I helped found in Washington, D.C., and all of a sudden it clicked. And it wasn't like, hey, all of a sudden I was an expert in economics or had a deep historical knowledge or was writing books or anything. But it was like my framework clicked into place. And it was like, all right, I know Kung Fu. But it was like, okay, I know Austrian economics now. And it was that moment like, all right, it's fully downloaded. Everything's there. And
did you read any particular books or websites?
Then when I was running for office, Ethics of Liberty by Murray Rothbard was a really seminal experience for me. And that was what got me on the path of analyzing everything philosophically. And I think slowly, in the way that my economic framework came together in an epiphanal moment, I've been, maybe over the course of the last few years, doing the same thing, developing my philosophical framework.
Interesting.
Interesting story is just how you got into libertarianism, anarchism. Were you born that way, or did you have to learn it?
Well, I was born Jewish, and I lived in Brooklyn, and that pretty much means everyone around me was a socialist, and so was I. Ayn Rand came to Brooklyn College to lecture, and I came to boo and hiss her because she was evil, because she favored capitalism. And I booed and hissed her all I could, and then they had this lunch in her honor, and they said anyone could come to the lunch, even if you disagreed, and I wanted to get her more because I hadn't had enough booing and hissing at her. And the lunch was a long, long table, maybe 50 people on a side, about 100 people, and she was sitting at the head of the table, and I was relegated to the foot of the table, about 100 yards away, or maybe 50 yards away, I'm not sure. And I turned to my neighbor and I said, what's this capitalist stuff? It's no good. It's, you know, greed and, you know, starving kids in the street. And he said, well, I don't really know, but the people who do are at the other end of the table. So I went there and I stuck my head between Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden's. And I said, there's a socialist here who wants to debate someone about socialism and capitalism. And they said, who is it? And I said, it's me. And Brandon was very generous and gracious. And he said, I'll come to the other end of the table where there's room to speak. And on two conditions. One, you don't let the conversation lapse with this one discussion. You continue it until we resolve it, and I promised. And the other is you read two books that I'm going to recommend, and I promised that. And the two books were Atlas Shrugged and Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. Well, after I read those two books, and I had maybe 4 or 5 discussions with him in his apartment and in Ayn Rand's apartment with her, and I think Alan Greenspan was there and a few others, Peikoff. I was converted to, I guess, not objectivism, but to at least libertarianism. I didn't really go for objectivism. It seemed very cultish to me. And I only agreed with the economics and the politics. I couldn't understand or comprehend their metaphysics, epistemology, and all that stuff. And I wasn't interested in it. Then, to make a long story short, I met Murray Rothbard about a year or two later. And in about 5 seconds, well, it's probably 5 minutes, he converted me to anarchism. He sort of used the same argument from Henry Hazlitt that I had been using on leftists to convert them to, you know, privatizing the post office or privatizing anything that the government does because of inefficiency and immorality. And then I was an anarchist, and this was maybe 1965. I think I met Ayn Rand in 1962 or 1963. And then I was an anarchist after having met Murray, and ever since I've been a follower of his. He's been my mentor and my friend, and I'm just privileged to have met him.
First question I ask everybody is, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, hi, Jeff. First, thank you for having me on. I might be a little bit different than your normal guest because I do not self-label myself as an anarchist. I prefer the label libertarian. Of course, I know you're going to ask me next, why do you not label yourself as an anarchist? I've read anarcho-capitalist text, literature, Murray Rothbard, all that. I agree with a lot of it. I would love to live in a, society, peaceful capitalist society with, 100% voluntary exchanges. That sounds wonderful to me, but I do have some questions, I'll be honest, about how we get there. And I do have some questions about how exactly some things would work in that society. But I'm honestly a very pessimistic person. I'm a half...
Living in Washington, D.C. might do that to you.
I've always been, though. People think I'm very cheery and happy, but no, I'm very pessimistic. So I wonder, I don't think you could achieve that in my lifetime. So I identify as a libertarian, and I believe what's most effective for me, I'm just speaking on myself, is, reducing the state and getting the state out of people's life as much as possible. So, I advocate for policies like ending the drug war, ending the wars, ending Obamacare, all these other stuff. I think that's more effective for me.
Yeah, and that's what I'd like to ask everyone is, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, it was just a matter of consistency. I distinctly remember I was into Austrian economics. I called myself, my progression was a conservative, then a libertarian, and I remember reading Rothbard's For a New Liberty, and I was amused. I remembered saying to my parents, whoa, this guy doesn't just want to cut taxes, he wants to get rid of taxes, this guy's crazy. And then, I don't know, it was just thinking through the logic of it, I guess, and just seeing more and more examples of how governments, not only in the abstract are they doing things that seem a little bit dubious, but even pragmatically, they weren't achieving the goals that they were supposed to. And as the more and more I saw that, at some point I just realized they don't even provide law and defense. Like, that was my last holdout, to say, oh, you need a government for that stuff. And then once that went, it was just refreshing. So that happened, I think, my freshman year in college is when I finally made that switch to say, okay, I'm an anarchist.
Wow, that's great. And ask is, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, it was really a matter of, I was raised conservative, Republican, libertarian-leaning, constitutionalist, that general ballpark. And over the years, it was really just a matter of, I like to debate and argue, and I like to win. And you don't win if there are contradictions inside your own head. So I'd have an argument, and I'd back up and say, yeah, on that one point, I wasn't all that, here I am saying, you have no right to force me to pay for your welfare state, but for some reason, I get to force you to pay for my military. So little contradictions like that, and I kept whittling them away. A lot of this process happened talking about things with my wife Tessa, and we both sort of helped nudge each other until we just fell off the status cliff entirely and realized, whoops, we just whittled away the last thing that is government, and what's left is freedom. So I sort of accidentally got there, and it was a very slow process. I know a lot of people doing it a lot faster now, but it took me years to let go of that thing of, well, we need government, we have to have a ruling class to make sure the good guys win. So it's just a slow arguing with other people and then arguing with myself to try to get consistent. And eventually I came to the realization that you cannot be consistent and believe in government. It doesn't work. The concept itself is self-contradictory. So I just kind of fell off the political spectrum and turned into a voluntarist.
So, T, thanks for being on with us. And the first question I have to ask you, though, is how did you become an anarchist?
Thanks for having me, Jeff. How did I become an anarchist? Actually, through zombie movies. People often ask me how did I get there.
That's the most original or different answer to how you became an anarchist yet, through zombie movies. Interesting.
Yeah, I just started off looking at zombie films. I love end of the world type movies and scenarios, stuff like that. Looking at it on the internet, and then over the course of time, I came across the term SHTF and WROL. And I started looking into those types of little films. Then I came across the term prepper, which I was like, hold on, wait, is there people really preparing for something? Like, is there something really about to happen? I need to go buy my AR-15 tomorrow? So, and from that, I just ended up stumbling across Infowars.com, which led me to become, for a while I was a diehard anti-globalist, but toned down rhetoric on that a little bit. And then I led to Gary Johnson, then Adam Kokesh. Once I became a libertarian, like I'm not sure whose quote this was. I think it was Stephen Monuk's. The difference between a libertarian and an anarchist is 6 months, and that's pretty much. It was a little bit shorter than that. About 4 or 5 months after I was a real staunch libertarian, I just kept on going down the path, and eventually led to anarcho-capitalism.
How did you become a voluntarist?
Oh man, I always feel like people expect a grand story with this one. Well, as you said, I started from a conservative background, so I was really kind of into conservative thinkers, speakers. I watched a bit of Fox News, all that. I even volunteered for the party once. And when I started taking political sciences in university and just kind of reading more content about different ideologies, it just kind of dawned on me the problems with my initial conservative ideology and the authoritarian aspects of controlling people's morals, especially with social conservatism. I'd still consider myself somewhat conservative, but I don't believe in forcing any of my personal morals on other people. And that just kind of came from personal realization. It didn't come from any grand realization. I did obviously read Ayn Rand's books. I've listened to Thomas Sowell. Let's see, who else? Of course, Ron Paul, watched all his videos, love Ron Paul. So those kind of thinkers influenced me a tiny bit as well, but it was more just a realization of how immoral a lot of the ideologies on both the authoritarian right and left were, and how I wouldn't like other people's morals being forced on me. And I wouldn't like other people using my funds, property, money, life, anything for their personal goals or how they think the world should be.
How did you become an anarchist?
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Jeff, for having me. I really appreciate it. Happy to be here. So how I became an anarchist? Well, I guess I was always a libertarian. And then, I really didn't have the internet too much until about 2002 in the run-up to the Iraq War. And so, I'd been on and I'd had it for a little while in the past and all that. But I had not really been exposed to any libertarian thought other than, kind of what you would hear from maybe Cato or the Libertarian Party, something like that. So I never was really, very closely associated with the Libertarian Party or anything like that. But just all the libertarians that I knew were basically, as far as I knew anyway, were limited republic, constitutionalists. And, my argument always was, and it was kind of a pragmatic argument too, that, we'd all like to see no state, but really you got to have just enough of one to prevent a worse one from replacing it. And so, that's the world we live in kind of thing. And then it wasn't until the run-up to the Iraq War, I was reading antiwar.com all the time, and they were linking to LewRockwell.com. And I started reading Lew Rockwell about, in fact, it was his review of Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, The National Defense Myth. And it was just about, at the very bottom line, that's the game they're selling. If you're the absolute minarchist, the argument is you got to have enough of a state to keep a worse one from replacing it, basically. And Lew's argument and Hoppe's argument was that doesn't wash, because you look at these guys and all they do is get us into trouble and start wars and do, the very opposite of real national security for the country and the people in the country. And so, we're just better off without them. We just don't need them. And I guess I had always thought that all anarchists were basically anarcho-communists. I never knew that there were like these, bow-tied Austrian free market guys who actually were willing to be 100% anti-state, the Mises Institute and so forth. So as soon as I learned about that, I thought, oh yeah, that's for me. I read Rothbard, Anatomy of the State, and Left and Right, The Prospects for Liberty, and Confessions of a Right-Wing Liberal, and these kinds of things. And I says, oh, okay. I get it now. I don't have to be a constitutional. I kind of thought I had to be a constitutionalist, but as soon as I found out I didn't have to be, that was the end of that, I guess.
When and why did you become an anarchist?
Well, I think it really started when I was younger. I had a real stroke of luck. The personal computer came out around the time I was 10 years old, and it was about 1980. And I was just enthralled by it. And I was very lucky. My grandfather, who was an old ham radio operator, which was sort of the pre-sequel to the internet, he was talking to people around the world for decades over radio. He also showed an interest in it, and he was excited that I was showing an interest. So he said, I'll buy you a computer, but we don't have a lot of money, so we're going to buy one from Vietnam. It was an Apple II Plus clone computer called a Unitron, and I had to build it myself. But once I was on it, it was like a whole new world to me. And so I really started not caring about school too much, which was a good thing because of all the indoctrination they do in those schools. And by the time I was about 14, probably getting into high school, I approached my mom, and actually the principal called, and they said, he's really not coming to school very often, what's going on? And I said to my mom, listen, can we do a deal here? I'm not interested in 99% of the stuff going on there. I'm not interested in getting beat up every day. I'm really interested in these computers, but there's no computer classes or anything at that point. It was still very early on.
Yeah.
And so I did a deal with my mom, and I said, okay, because she still wanted me to get that government certificate of,
Badge of obedience.
Badge of obedience, yes. And so I said, okay, I know you want me to get this, so I'll do that. But I'll just go for the tests mostly. And what I would do is I'd just read the textbook the day before, and you would retain enough information to pass the test. And the rest of the time I just spend on my computer. And then at night also, while most people are watching their programming on TV, and there's no accident they call it programming, I missed all that. I was just on my computer all day, all night, just searching the world, discovering new things constantly. It was so exciting. And so I think because of that, I sort of didn't get all the programming and indoctrination that a lot of people get. And then when the internet came out, I was so excited again. I said, I've been waiting for them all to put all these computers together. It's taken them too long, but I'm glad they finally did it. And I started a financial website in Canada called stockhouse.com, and it still is the top financial website in Canada. And by 1999-2000, it was worth $240 million. Wow. It had 250 people working for it in 8 different countries. And but then a few months later, after the tech bubble collapsed, it was almost worthless. And I would go to people, I'd say to MBAs and stockbrokers, what happened? And almost all of them said the exact same thing. They just shrug and go, that just happens sometimes. And I just couldn't accept that as a, there must be more than that.
Just animal spirits.
I didn't know Keynes at the time, but if I talked to a Keynesian, he'd say, it's just animal spirits, or in the end, we're all dead anyway.
Yeah.
So I decided, okay, I've got a little bit of money now, I sold this internet company. I'm going to buy a sailboat and try to sail around the world and try to see what's going on with my own eyes, not through the lens of the media. And during that process, I managed to sink the sailboat in El Salvador, and I just kept going for about 3 or 4 more years. Along the way, I was constantly reading on the internet, and I came across Austrian economics, and that's what finally explained so simply, so easily, so obviously what had happened. Just an increase in the money supply by Alan Greenspan for the Y2K thing.
Build a bubble.
Yeah, build a bubble, pop it. And along the way also, I was traveling a lot, and I came across an article by Doug Casey. I'd never heard of him before. Maybe I heard of him, but I didn't know much about him. And the article really caught my attention because it was about immigrations and customs people, and it was saying, don't be nice to these people. They have no right to ask you where you're going. Yeah. And I'd been feeling this, but I didn't know you could actually think like that. That actually, I said it to myself in my head. I still remember saying, I didn't know you could think like this. And I went on to read a lot of Doug Casey. And then I actually had the luck to have dinner with Doug Casey in Vancouver soon after. And he very grandfatherly asked me a bunch of questions. At the end he said, in Doug Casey style, you know what you are, don't you? And I said, no, what am I? And he said, you're a libertarian. And I said, what's that? And I didn't even know, I'd never heard the word before. Spent another few months reading libertarian stuff. And then, of course, it's a natural evolution. Once you start to realize how little we need the state, then you start to realize we don't need the state at all, and actually the world would be a much better place without the state. I read a book, the book that turned me into an anarchist was The Market for Liberty. Very small, it's actually on the internet for free in a PDF format, and it shows what the world would be like in a state without the state, and it's glorious and it's exciting, and I was just enthralled, and ever since then I've been an anarchist. Let me ask you, Josie, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, I think that I've always actually been one. I just didn't have a term for it. I didn't know that that's what it was. I have, from a very young age, I was raised in an environment where I was encouraged to question everything. Although I went through 12 years of rigid Catholic schooling, I was almost unschooled before we knew what it meant, in a way that I was encouraged to read. I was shown the other side of things, so it was always there, and I always had those doubts, and I always had this idea of that it wasn't necessary, that we didn't need to be told what was right and what was wrong, and it kind of was taking our free will away, in a sense. So I always had these feelings, but never really discussed it, because at that point it was just so abnormal to feel that way or think that way. I mean, I was 13 years old once I started really getting into reading these things, and I read Fahrenheit 451 at age 13, and I was like, wow, I just started seeing a lot of things happening in real life that just paralleled that, mirrored that. So it wasn't until, I would say, I don't even know, a year ago, I would say, that I actually understood what the word anarchism meant. And I was like, oh, there's a word for that. I actually picked up Larken Rose's book, and I didn't tell him, I didn't read it until a couple months after we were working together, but I read the first 2 pages, and I was like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, duh, someone else gets it too. And I just hadn't spoken with anyone about it, and then once I realized it and had terms to put on it, and knew that I wasn't the only person thinking these things, it was a lot easier for me to explore and discuss and learn and develop my philosophy.
Question I always ask everybody is, how did you become an anarchist?
I don't remember. I remember the time and roughly, but you kind of forget your influences, right? I'd say in like 11th grade of high school, I was kind of apolitical, and a librarian recommended The Fountainhead to me, and Atlas Shrugged, and so I became quickly a Randian type libertarian, but hostile to libertarianism and anarchism for a couple years, until I realized that she was wrong, that I shouldn't read people like Rothbard, etc. So I read, the Law, and then I started reading Rothbard and the Tannehills and Nozick, and something between David Friedman and Robert Nozick and the Tannehills and Rothbard, probably Rothbard, made me finally give up the ghost around, let's say, 88 or so, and just realize I was an anarchist, which was a liberating moment. So to my mind, it's just the end result of a consistent, principled libertarianism.
Are you an anarcho-capitalist?
Well, I don't know. Thanks for having me so much, by the way. I don't know. There's this great guy on YouTube called That Guy T, which some of you may know.
He's a past Anarchast guest.
Is he?
Yes.
And I like him. I like some of the stuff he says. And the more I sort of, they say when you start liberal when you're younger and you turn into a conservative when you're older. When you start to have money and sort of things make a bit more sense to you. Well, I started as a conservative, and I think I'm going off the deep end into something else as I get older. So I sort of read about you guys and did a bit of reading, and I'm sort of thinking, well, I don't know if I am yet. Maybe in the course of this conversation we can discover the definitive answer. But I certainly am fascinated by this, and I think we have many of the same enemies in common, which is always a good sign.
Let's get right into it. How did you become an anarchist?
Number one, I hate labels. I don't like being called anarchist, but a lot of people seem to really identify me as that, primarily because, to me, the main solutions lay within our strength, our ideology, our thoughts, and our principles. So, to me, I don't think the government could ever fix anything. I think they usually mess a lot of things up. And the only real solution, the only real answer to all the problems that we face is really revolved around just me and you or other people communicating effectively. So that's what I focus on, is that communication aspect, and I try not to let it be biased in any way, shape, or form. So that's why I don't label myself with any particular ideology. My main thing is, with communication, proper communication, good communication, we can solve anything. But it's about knowing each other and talking to each other and not being afraid of each other to break those walls and those boundaries that the mainstream media and the elites created between us that make us hate each other when we're on the train looking at each other, just vengeful and angry and sad and miserable because we're living this daily life. But I'm going off in different tangents already.
The very first question I have to ask you is, how did you become an anarchist?
Hi, Jeff. I have answered that question before in lots of different ways. I've written little essays about it, but I just want to isolate this one point that I think gets lost, and it's really the essence of what made me realize the hopelessness that what I say is that the idea of self-limiting government is a utopian fantasy. It's never going to happen. And essentially the way I figured it was this. I tried to figure, what could the founders have done differently? What did they not figure out? What did they not write into the Constitution? What didn't they anticipate? But if you read what they've written and what they personally were about, their education, you could not have in human history have come up with a humanly possible experiment that was better designed to try self-limiting government than these guys at this time in this land. Now, I'm not for stealing land. The Indian question is something, slavery is something, but in their minds, they had a blank slate to work with, and they put it together anticipating everything, including banks and the corporations that rise up around them. This is what they thought of. They did everything they could. Thomas Jefferson, the right man for the job, was in that place at the right time, and he did his very, very best. But of course, there was always an Alexander Hamilton who was sitting there with a central bank and a constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. So in my mind, the American experiment lasted 8 years. And the fact that you could not conduct the experiment better than it was conducted, in my opinion. And so you have to then look at what the actual outcome was, which is we created this giant seat of power. We delegated to it the essential human right, which is self-defense. Really, there isn't even, I would say there is a right to life, but that's not the fundamental right. The fundamental right is to defend the life, because people die all the time. If there's a real right, you wouldn't have cancer, but you have the right to defend it. It's where all power comes from in interacting with other people. I mean, maybe philosophically there's a flaw in that, but I don't think so, that the government gets all of its rights, all of its power from our right to self-defense, which we have delegated to it, and then asked it to treat us kindly. And of course, instead, it pays its cronies, and that's what we got. So I just realized that you can't establish a seat of power and then expect it not to be filled by, the sociopaths who like stuff like that.
Yeah, you're totally. Buddy is. How did you become an anarchist?
Well, thank you for inviting me on the show, Jeff. I really never thought of myself as an anarchist until you sent that email. I said, well, I definitely fall under a lot of the same beliefs, because I think that it starts with understanding the difference between right and wrong. And then from there, understanding that all forms of human slavery are wrong. And anarchist it comes from the word anarchos, which means without rulers. So if you're self-responsible and self-reliant, it seems natural that you wouldn't need to be ruled or managed or have a master. So I went down my own path of looking into what is the nature of obedience to authority and who am I as a person. And I think it naturally takes you down this progression where you own yourself, or you discover you own yourself after many years of being told you don't. And because of that, you have new freedom. You have to own yourself intellectually and as physically. So there's intellectual self-defense and physical self-defense necessary to be without rulers. In history, there's an idea called Swaraj that comes from India, which means self-rule or self-reign. So it's the same idea that if you're an adult and you're responsible, you shouldn't need any rulers to tell you what to do.
Ben, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, I kind of cheated. I had an easy start. My parents were not actual anarchists, but they were very suspicious of the government. They didn't see that it had a lot of use, and they didn't think, like my father was a self-taught, unlicensed pilot for years and years and years. And the more you think about that, the more it kind of makes your head want to explode. Like, how do you self-teach how to fly an airplane? But he did. He was a pretty smart guy. And he never got a license because he didn't think that it was right, that he didn't think the government had like some kind of right to the air to tell him where he could or couldn't fly. And, so there were anarchical ideas in there right along. My mom was very suspicious of any story that came out from the government, and she typically just believed first that the government's lying, which is a real good start. If you have that as your starting point, it's not hard to go the rest of the way. And then I worked during the 1970s, I worked for NORML a little bit, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and that introduced me to more of the philosophical path towards the libertarian thinking. I was in the Libertarian Party in the 80s, eventually doing some work and voting for Ron Paul in 1988. And then by that time, I was already starting to realize, this whole, the whole idea of using politics to accomplish your goal is flawed, at least in the sense that it's simply not working. That was my way of looking at things in 1988. It wasn't that we shouldn't use politics or that government is itself completely flawed. At that time, I was thinking, it's just not working. We've been doing this over and over, and the situation keeps getting worse and worse. So whatever it is that the Libertarian Party and whatever it is that we've, all of us, who have wanted liberty for hundreds of years, we're not moving in the right direction. Now, my daughter, being raised under that, with somebody who thinks that way, she was pretty much a full-blown anarchist right from the beginning. So about the time that she was becoming an adult, and now we're talking up into the early 2000s, she began challenging me on all of those standard libertarian things that I had believed over the years. And she has a real good Socratic method that employs logic and reasoning and consistency. And as I attempted to formulate my answers to her in a logical and consistent manner, I came to the conclusion that there's no such thing as a legitimate government. The two words are exact opposite. They're like jumbo shrimp. They can't exist in the same place at the same time. It's an oxymoron. And so then I began to re-examine things, going back, reading Rothbard and some of these other things.
Vete arriba.
Uh-oh, were you talking to me, Jeff?
No, sorry, I was just yelling at I got about 10 kids in my house right now, telling them to go upstairs and stop crying. I wasn't really yelling at them, but you can hear them. I said, get upstairs. Anyway, go ahead.
I thought maybe Skype was messing with us for a minute. But no, anyway, so, as I began to re-examine these things in the early 2000s, I realized that I had already abandoned what might be called the American system, this weird democratic republic thing. I had abandoned it by 89 or so, when I realized that the system is just broken. It's not fixable. But to completely abandon government was more around the early 2000 range, when I just came to the conclusion that, she's right. It's not that the system is broke. The system is designed the way that it is. The Constitution was written to give us exactly the government we've got. And what you've seen in Canada, what we've seen in the US, what has been seen all across Europe, where these governments are really old and they just get worse. And, by re-examining it like that and really thinking it through, a lot of people come to the point of where they start saying, okay, but without government, how would you, and then you fill in your pet peeve. I didn't even go through that. I just came to the realization that if government were out of the way, then things would get done. Everything that we want done is going to be done with or without government. It's just that government is this big stumbling block that constantly gets in the way, takes its cut, and slows the process down. It holds back, innovation, holds back the development of wealth and all these things. So so that was it. By 2008, I went back, I got my hands dirty, I voted for Ron Paul again, and even when I went down to the voting booth to do it, I just felt really dirty. I felt like I needed to wash afterwards. And after that, I just thought, I've got to follow my conscience. I've got to make my feet walk the way my mouth is talking. And to do that, I have to completely abandon any involvement in trying to sway politics the way I want. Because if I'm using politics for as a means to an end that I want, then I'm no different than Barack Obama or, what was the last clown's name? Bush. Or I'm no different than them in a moral sense. I'm doing the exact thing that they were doing. I just want a slightly different goal.
I guess is how did you get into the freedom sort of thing? How did you get into anarchism or freedom or libertarianism?
Well, I would say probably the biggest step for me, and the timing of this, of course, is interesting, was the Ron Paul campaign of 2007 and 2008. When I had been a history teacher years prior, so I had always been interested in these kind of things, and I was just kind of casually watching the debates as they started towards the end of 2007 and progressed into 2008. And I said, wow, that guy, a lot of the things he says makes a lot of sense, but I was kind of confused about why he was being allowed on television to say them. Obviously, the wind was taken out of my sails when I saw how controlled the media was with respect to his message. And, from there, I started looking for news sources of media. I'd already been listening to a show called Free Talk Live for a couple years, and at that point I had pretty much become a minarchist libertarian. But after the whole Ron Paul campaign fizzled, I started getting into shows like Freedomain Radio and Wes Bertrand's Complete Liberty podcast, and that was kind of like the final jump. I was reluctant, to make that final step towards what people call anarchy. I usually use the word voluntarism, or simply, principles consistent with the way that we live our personal lives. Like, we're all sort of voluntarist libertarians in our personal lives. Like, we don't, if we're not psychopathic, we don't threaten and hurt other people to try and solve our problems and meet our goals. So, like, just kind of applying those ideas consistently to the public or political sphere, that seemed like the right path to go.
Well, I should back up a little and start from the beginning before I go into how I got there. I came from a conservative Christian Republican home and background, and like a lot of people, I had never questioned my beliefs very carefully. I had sort of had the worldviews that were handed to me by my parents. And I met a man named Tom, and he's now my husband, and he's an excellent person, but he has about 20 years on me of just a lot of reading about just about every idea out there that you can think of. And I met this man, and he was very interesting, and he knew a lot about a lot of different things. And as such, he was able to give me a certain amount of space to start questioning things that I had grown up assuming. And a lot of that started with my beliefs about the nature of reality and, what is this thing called God, and what is government, and what is it doing? And he wasn't an anarchist yet, actually. But what he did do was he did something that my family hadn't really, from my perspective, given me the freedom to do. He gave me the space to question things and to come out and start thinking about things I hadn't before. So what happened was we both sort of got into researching the basically the real version of U.S. history that isn't taught in American compulsory education. And that sort of led both of us down a rabbit hole. And we went through a stage of being Ron Paul libertarians, and I love Dr. Paul, and I think he's been instrumental in in moving forward the ideas of liberty. But right around the time that I would say it was 2012 or so, I was doing what a lot of people are doing when they're looking into all kinds of these sorts of ideas and researching history, and I was going through different various libertarian YouTube channels and just watching videos about stuff. And I came across a video that a lot of people are probably familiar with now in the movement called The Philosophy of Liberty. Do you know that video?
I'm not sure. I've watched so many videos like this. Maybe you can jog my memory.
It's a video that's done. It's basically done via illustration, sort of little cartoons and depictions. And
do you know who did it? I think I know the one you're talking about.
I forget the name of the person that did it, but it comes. It's got a little background, perfect background sort of bumper music going on the whole time, and it comes up in blue letters, kind of fun blue font, like The Philosophy of Liberty, and it starts off saying that the philosophy of liberty is based on the premise that you own yourself, and no one has a higher claim on your life than you do. To say otherwise would make you a slave. I came across this video, and the video does an excellent job of outlining, from start to finish, the entire premise of what it means to actually be a free individual and what that looks like if you live it out, and what it means to violate that freedom. And I had at this point had the idea that, government should do like the least amount of things possible. It should print currency, and it should, maybe have some sort of defense force or something. But I was still a minarchist, and I thought the idea was perfectly explained. I couldn't think of anything to refute it. And then what I noticed happening was, as the days went on after I watched that video, I started applying the notion of no individual getting to initiate violent force on another to everyday situations that I was used to seeing, situations portrayed in the media, things like, some customer complaining about a business that, they think should have served them but didn't. And so now they're using government force to sue the person, the business owner, and take their money. Things like discrimination and these things in the media where people are, think they have a right to someone else's stuff and resources and money by saying, I think that I should get to be served at this particular business. And I started applying the philosophy of liberty to all these scenarios that I was used to seeing. And I watched reality break down in front of me, the reality that I knew, because I realized all of that was wrong. Because it's all portrayed, it's so carefully portrayed that the person who's really initiating aggression is the victim, and somehow they always deserve to just have the stuff of someone else. And when I took it down to the individual level, logically, I couldn't get around the fact that there's no situation in which someone gets to use physical force to decide for someone else what they're going to do with their body and their property. And then I realized, well, holy hell, that totally does away with anything government is. There's nothing government, it would just be a bunch of guys standing around doing nothing. Because to act as a government entity, they have to initiate force. That broke it all down for me. And so I would say about a week or two after seeing that video, I realized, well, that makes no form of government legitimate at all. And that's when I realized, wait a minute, there's a word for that. And that's when I realized, I think I'm an anarchist. And that was close to the end of 2012. So I've been an anarchist for about 3 years now. It's been a wild ride, but it was an awesome experience to get there because it sort of freed me from all the fog and the confusion.
To start with, how did you become an anarchist?
You know, when I first started doing libertarian activism in the early 90s, there was a joke that went, it's going, what's the difference between an anarchist and a libertarian? And the answer was, you know, 2 or 3 election cycles if you're paying attention. And I was paying attention, so it didn't take long for me to realize that, freedom good, government bad. And as years went on, it became freedom good, government bad, bad, bad. I think I'm up to 9 bads or something. I got to start over. But it's you have so many examples of where culture is where the driving force is. So when I talk to people like you that travel the world, I am really way more interested in what the culture is of a place and how the people interact and what their social norms are and so on than I am anything about some statute or a constitution or anything like that. That's a byproduct, or I'm looking for the long-term view of how people interact with each other in various cultures.
Co-capitalist.
Well, great question. I spent a lot of time being a hardcore leftist, like a lot of young African Americans are. So I grew up a leftist, and back in the college, I started kind of getting into kind of economics, and I read about Thomas Sowell. He was the guy that really kind of led me to libertarianism. Him and Walter Williams created both of those guys. I read Basic Economics, and it just really changed my life. And they did a great job of highlighting how government pretty much in every form of the marketplace, every form of the economy just screws everything up. Walter Williams started, he led me up to libertarianism in general. Now the only spot where myself, and even though Walter Williams is one of those libertarians that actually believes that the government itself is a corrupt entity, and but he considers it a necessary evil. But myself, I was like, well, I don't think it needs to exist at all, and that's how I kind of became a ANCAP. It wasn't really, and it's funny, I tell the story a lot, and people think, oh, well, at some point you read Rothbard, and at some point you read all of these guys, and honestly, that wasn't the case. I became an ANCAP, and I wanted abolition of the state long before I'd even picked up a Murray Rothbard book or anything like that. It was really, again, Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell that just led me to libertarianism, and I figured it out for myself.
Ask you though is, how did you become an anarchist?
Well, I have always believed in deciding for myself, governing myself, and I don't appreciate anybody. When I was a little kid, the idea of a bully trying to intimidate you and get you to do something you didn't want to do, or basically get you to submit, that never sat well with me. So I guess from a very, very young age, I chose never to bow to anybody. Obviously this word anarchist has been really abused, like everything in this world that we're living in today. Orwell's reality of the abuse of language couldn't be more profound. So obviously many people misunderstand the meaning of the word, but in the true sense of the word, of an anarchist, governing yourself and not being willing to bow to, especially to tyrannical authority. This is something that's always been in me, but I've never actually labeled myself anything. But I'm not insulted, or am in many ways. I'm very much happy to be called an anarchist, but I've never sat well with the label, to be honest.
No, that's the question I ask everyone is, how did you become an anarchist?
All right. Well, I guess all of us have been practicing anarchy for pretty much all our lives, right? If you don't use violence in your day-to-day life to solve problems, you're already an anarchist, whether you knew it or not. But I guess for me personally, it's more of a childhood sort of thing, kind of anti-authoritative, sort of. I never really liked being told what to do, right? As a kid, I never really liked the punishments that came with it, without my consent or choice. And as a child, you have to kind of run away, you have to scream, you have to hide, you have to cower, because you have no really any way to fight back, or you really have no say, right? Because even if you did, they'll say that don't talk back, right? You're being a my way, I guess, when I was a kid to kind of fight back when I was a kid was really just to give my father the silent treatment. So like. He would do something I didn't like, and I, kind of force as punishment to do what it is that is required of me. And of course, when dinner time came around, he'll say, "Okay, here you go. Here's our Jeff Berwick can in a bowl, whatever, and eat." And I wouldn't say anything. I just stand there. And then, of course, he wants to play the game. So 2 o'clock in the morning, hours later, he comes downstairs. I'm still standing there, haven't said anything to him, and that will go on for days. And I guess that was my own way to, I guess, ostracize my own father when I was a child. So I don't know. I guess anyone who kind of rebels against something they feel unjust is, in a way, an anarchist themselves.
How did you become an anarchist?
Well, you know, Jeff, I generally try to reject labels. I hate labels, and I hate labels for the reason that the second you throw a label out there, somebody knows everything about you. So I try not to label myself anything more than pro-freedom. Although to me, take the word libertarian, a real libertarian and an anarchist, as we might use the term, which is an anarcho-capitalist, are really the same thing. Sometimes I like to use the word autarchist because, just to be a little more precise, I'm for self-rule. I'm not for no rule, I'm for self-rule, and I'm for iron-fisted dictatorship of myself. So how'd I get there? Well, I came to law school a real solid Republican. I was a fan of Rush Limbaugh and probably Ronald Reagan. And then I ran into Butler Schaefer. And Butler Schaefer really had a huge influence on me. I mean, this guy, Butler doesn't answer any questions, and so he really believes in the Socratic method. And so Butler just posed a lot of questions, and he posed some very, very good questions. And I can remember a long period of time where I would go to Butler's office almost every day after law school with a brand new question about how on earth something could work without the government regulating it. And I would go in there and say, hey, you know, Butler, without the government running X, we'd have complete chaos, some variety of that question. And of course, Butler would look at me and say, yeah, sounds about right. And I would say, well, see, there you go. We need government for something. And he would say to me the simple question, well, what do you think would happen after that, Mark? And of course, I would respond with, well, I mean, of course, this would happen, some other horribly chaotic thing. And then Butler would just simply say, well, what do you think would happen next? And then, of course, parade me down the road until I would get to the point where I would say, oh, yeah, I guess that does kind of make sense. And then I would leave satisfied for the moment, and then I'd go home and I'd sort of think up another area that we absolutely positively needed the government. It was really a great experience because rather than sort of hitting me over the head with, God damn it, coercion and force and all this stuff is really bad, he just sort of let me wrap my brain around it. And then once I got it, it just made sense to me. And I like to present it like this. Either you think that we can have a nice, civilized, productive society without having the need to hit our neighbors over the head, or you don't. And I've come to the conclusion that I think I can live just a fine life without any problems, without any need whatsoever to coerce my neighbor into anything at all. And so if that makes me pro-freedom, anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, I don't know. I generally don't like constitutionalist because that doesn't really mean much of anything. But that's how I got there.
That's great. Did you cut right now, Mark Passio? How did you become an anarchist?
Jeff, thanks so much for inviting me onto the program. Yeah, it is an interesting story that probably hasn't been undergone by many. In my past, I grew up in a traditional, pretty standard Roman Catholic Italian family from South Philadelphia. And, you know, they were the kind of people that never really questioned too much about the status quo. You know, they didn't ask many questions, and they just went along to get along. And I accepted without much questioning myself back then in my youth a large amount of the religious indoctrination and dogma that I had been given by my family and school teachers, etc. I guess in my late grade school years and early high school years, I really began to question those dogmatic religious belief systems. And because I lacked a lot of the knowledge about how religion was, you know, astrotheological in nature and was a, you know, large control system. The anger about learning, you know, about a lot of the falsities of my religious indoctrination earlier on in my life kind of turned to a lot of hatred. And I wanted to gravitate or find the exact polar opposite, the antithesis of those belief systems. And so I gravitated toward the occult, but I specifically gravitated toward dark occultism, as I refer to it. And in my case, it was LaVeyan Satanism. Satanism, the ideology of Satanism as put forward by Anton LaVey in the Satanic Bible. When I became involved in dark occultism in general, I began espousing the satanic ideology. And the Church of Satan actually heard about me through writings and music that I had put forward that were, expressive of the satanic worldview. And so LaVey himself appointed me a priest within his organization and wanted me to start what they call a grotto. That's, their word for a coven in my area. And I never really looked at Satanism as kind of a collective ideology. So I declined that offer, but I became involved in some other grottos in this area, in this tri-state region. And upon attending some of them, I began to understand that there were people in high-level positions of power and influence in every single institutional walk of life that we can imagine that were populated by Satanists. At these grotto rituals, lawyers would show up, politicians, chiefs of police, judges, bankers,
all the worst kind of people,
school teachers, doctors, you name it. Every walk of life, media, law enforcement, entertainment, technology, medicine, education, you name the institution, there were Satanists in those institutions at high levels of influence and power in every one. And they were not working separately, to just increase their own personal power and influence by studying occult knowledge and how the mind can be manipulated and influenced, which is a huge part of dark occultism. They were working together toward a common collective agenda, which was to increase their own power, their collective power, and their group's power, their network's power, at the expense of everybody else's rights and freedoms. And they were very open about that agenda, sharing that at these rituals and grotto meetings. The awareness that dawned on me that I had become at a admittedly very low level with such an organized syndicate that was working to destroy human freedom made me take a step back and realize, my conscience could not allow me to proceed any further with that. And I wanted to do my best to try to explain to people how this network was operating. And so I became involved in, speaking on what Satanism really is, not the Hollywood variant of it that a lot of people believe that it is, but what the actual real tenets of organized Satanism are, and how this dark religion is really the religion that's ultimately controlling the world. The people in the corridors of power absolutely take this mindset and practice the tenets of this religious ideology, in many cases, whether they even realize it or not. Another big part of my work is helping the public to understand that in many cases they have themselves subscribed to satanic ideology without even understanding it, because of how pervasively it is put forward in the media and in popular culture. So ultimately, recognizing, getting a little sneak peek behind the corridors of power, so to speak, and recognizing how evil the mindset was at that level. And again, admittedly, I was only operating at a very low level. It goes far beyond the level of involvement in just getting your foot into, the Church of Satan and attending some grotto rituals, etc. Just that level that I became involved with, I saw the level of evil that was operating, and my conscience wouldn't allow me to go forward with it. And then further studies, of course, helped me to understand the complete illusion and total illegitimacy of all forms of authority and control over other people. And that was the, kind of the long winding road to me becoming an anarchist myself and teaching the principles of natural law, of real anarchy, and of truth.
That's wonderful.